Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're going to just dive right in. Hi again, my name's Nikki Caravelli, Assistant Planner with the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. Thanks for joining us for our fourth installment, I think now, in our 5-part series on the Adaptation Planning Guide. So here's our agenda for the day. We'll do the same thing as usual, just give a quick update on resources in the Adaptation Planning Guide, Phase 3 on Adaptation Frameworks, Pathways, and Strategies. Then we have a lovely panel of case studies as usual from some wonderful speakers from around the state. I'll introduce them later. And then we will also have a guest speaker on Adaptation Pathways as a kind of alternative approach or approach that you can use in tandem with adaptation planning guide process. And then we'll dive into a Q&A, and hopefully we will have tons of time for Q&A this time. Just a quick note on logistics, please feel free to use the chat. We have Sydney Short monitoring the chat for technical issues or questions, but we will be addressing all questions at the end of the webinar. Some speakers may address questions in the chat as they come online. Oops, sorry, I don't know what happened there. And we also have closed captions going available. So if you click that option on your little toolbar, you should see them pop up. Again, we're in our 4th webinar in this 5-part series on adaptation strategies. And just to keep it rolling here, a couple of guiding themes that we've touched on in those previous webinars are really honing in and centering equity throughout the entire adaptation planning process on all phases, making it relatable, using case studies and storytelling, humanizing the process, really intentionally involving community engagement throughout your process, making it a driver, and making the process interactive and collaborative with a wide range of stakeholders. Also looping in the concept of plan alignment and trying to integrate climate change resilience planning across multiple different plans and policies. And then finally, in the last webinar, we really touched on using best available science, climate vulnerability data to inform your adaptation strategies. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Taylor to talk about the Phase 3.
Hi, everyone. I'm joining you today from Sacramento, California on ancestral Nisenan tribal land. I'd like to start by thanking them for the stewardship of these lands for thousands of years. And I would love to hear where you're joining us from. I'm going to drop a link in the chat to nativeland.ca, which is a really helpful tool to figure out kind of the ancestral heritage of the lands in which you're on. As Nikki mentioned, today's webinar is on Phase 3, defining adaptation framework and strategies. Next slide, please. So there are 5 substeps to Phase 3. I'll go through them briefly, but they're also displayed on the screen. The first is building off the vulnerability assessment by summarizing the vulnerability and identifying priority issues. The second is confirming the goals and visions that we identified back in the first step during the scoping phase and making sure that they're still appropriate based on the vulnerability assessment. The third step is drafting adaptation strategies themselves. So based on your goals and visions, usually that's kind of a broad array of strategies that kind of fit that and fit what you found through your vulnerability assessment. You can use the APG and policy development experience as a resource. And then from there, deciding which of these strategies to prioritize. And then that 5th and last step, which has been important throughout all the steps, is a robust outreach and engagement process. So making sure we bring these strategies back to the community and conduct engagement activities to help refine the strategies. Next slide, please. So the focus of this phase is to have communities come away with a set of adaptation strategies that are responsive to their vulnerabilities and are appropriate given all other factors. Since policy development can be challenging, especially for practitioners who aren't use to the adaptation field, the APG includes a number of example strategies that are responsive to key vulnerabilities that communities can adapt for their own use. Next slide, please. Some of the core questions we're seeking to address include how to prepare adaptation strategies and to effectively prioritize them. We want to make sure communities have the means to address some of the big challenges for adaptation planning, such as addressing uncertainty and ensuring equitable resilience strategy. So included on this slide is some of those questions. So what is a strategy? How do strategies support this vision? How should we address uncertainty? What other considerations are there? And then what are the key factors to consider based on the vulnerability assessment conducted in the last phase? Next slide, please. Resources and examples of strategies for specific topics are organized into sectors, following the same framework as the State Adaptation Clearinghouse that we host over here at ICARP. And although communities can organize their strategies using whatever approach works best for them. So maybe this sectors-based approach isn't best, and that's up for each practitioner to decide based on the unique needs of their community. You'll notice that there aren't separate sectors for topics such as equity and environmental justice. And this is because these topics are overarching issues that should apply to work regardless of direct sector. They cut across numerous areas, so they should have continuous integration. Next slide, please. So the goal of outreach and engagement in phase 3 is to involve stakeholders in brainstorming and drafting adaptation strategies based on the results of the vulnerability assessment. Communities can involve stakeholders in the strategy development process. So the APG gives examples of pop-up booths at community events, interactive workshops, and other engagement formats. And while the project team should take this feedback and prioritize strategies, they can also involve the community through activities that engage residents or online analysis that provides community members with tools to understand and value each of the strategies. Phase 3 outreach must also include equity considerations when drafting and prioritizing adaptation strategies. Next slide, please. And it's important to point out that 2 appendices of the APG kind of apply to this phase and are really helpful. The first is Appendix B, Adaptation Pathways. We have a speaker today who will be speaking on the Adaptation Pathways strategy here. And then Appendix D is those examples of local adaptation strategies by sector. You can also find those over on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. Next slide, please. Yeah, and touching again on those resources that we have hosted up on the Adaptation Clearinghouse, resilienceca.org. So that includes the appendixes, APG phase 3, kind of in its short form, resources and case studies, and example adaptation strategies. Another really important resource that we always love to kind of highlight is a Civic Spark program, which is a means of kind of incorporating young professionals into the adaptation planning field, and also kind of that important capacity factor that kind of we know is a challenge for local jurisdictions. So if you're looking to find a way to kind of start to incorporate this program, they're accepting partner applications on a rolling basis and fellow applications. If you know any folks kind of hoping to break into the field and get involved, are due on April 30th. Next slide, please. And then we also have the new Resilient CA Adaptation Planning Map, RAP map, as we like to call it. And it was just published on the Adaptation Clearinghouse, and it's an open data tool and ongoing effort to inventory local government climate adaptation planning efforts across the state and to track local progress towards statewide adaptation planning goals. Next slide, please. And another useful resource that's provided by FEMA, US EPA, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, an association of Bay Area governments, is the Regional Resilience Toolkit. In their B appendix, they have a host of worksheets, and these are a great tool for providing ideas and language for local strategies that are responsive to the individual problem statements that are defined during phase 3 based off of the vulnerability assessment. And then I will hand it back over to Nikki.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Taylor. Lots of resources out there. So I'll just quickly touch on SB 379. I'm not going to go into this into too detail since we cover a lot of it in previous webinars, but honing in specifically on this last aspect. Oops, let me change the slide here. So SB 379 requires the development of adaptation policies, goals, and implementable adaptation measures. And so just to kind of briefly touch on this, and again, I really encourage you to check out the general plan guidelines for the specifics on this, as well as the specific code language, as there's a bit more detail on this, as well as on the vulnerability assessment requirements of SB 379 that I won't cover here. But as you're developing your adaptation framework and strategies, to meet the requirements of SB 379, you want to be keeping these implementation measures in mind, and whether you develop them now as part of your framework or later as a part of your implementation process, you're creating the measures then. These are some of the things you would keep in mind. So climate impacts related to new land uses, new essential public facilities that you might want to consider outside of at-risk areas, infrastructure that is in already at-risk areas, how to cooperate with public agencies at the local, state, regional, or federal level, and natural infrastructure. So these are all things that are included in the code requirements of SB 379 when you're going through your update, and are important to keep in mind as you're developing your strategy framework. So with no further time spent on introductions, I will pass it over to Shasta Gon, Environmental Director and Tribal Historic Preservation Officer from the Paula Band of Mission Indians, as our first case study speaker to talk a little bit about what the Paula Band has done on adaptation planning. Shasta, are you there? Oop. Or is it my internet? I can't tell if folks can still hear me.
Nikki, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, maybe Shasta is having some audio issues. Maybe we'll come back to you, Shasta. Oh, seeing a pop-up in the, nope, okay. Okay, Shelly, are you there? Maybe we can go to you first and then move to Shasta next.
Hi, Nikki. Yes, I am here. You want me to go next?
Yeah, is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Let me just share my screen. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here today, speaking to you from historic Nisenan land, also known as Sacramento. And my name is Shelly Jang. I am the climate change program analyst at the Sacramento Metropolitan Air Quality Management District. And I'm here today to talk to you about our Capital Region Urban Heat Island Mitigation Project. We started this project in 2018 and completed it last year, right as the pandemic was getting started. So that was very exciting. We embarked on this project because we recognized that urban heat was a critical challenge of the Sacramento region. We saw data from the California Department of Public Health that showed that the Sacramento region had higher emergency room visits and fatalities related to extreme heat than the state as an statewide average. And we also were inspired by a 2015 Cal EPA Urban Heat Island study. And so recognizing that this was a critical challenge, we wanted to undertake a study that would allow us to identify the vulnerable areas and the areas with high potential for implementation. We also wanted to identify specific and implementable strategies and understand how effective they were in different locations around the region and at different times of day. Our project partners on this were the Local Government Commission and the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative. We worked with Dr. Haider Taha at Alto Stratus for the urban heat island modeling. He's we were really lucky to be able to work with him, as he's one of the experts on heat island. And we also worked with WSP for transportation planning consulting. And our project was funded by a Caltrans Adaptation Planning grant. So to start with identifying solutions, we really had to know where the vulnerabilities were and which areas were most affected by the heat island. So our first step was to build this comprehensive model of the urban heat island effect in Sacramento. And this relied on a lot of localized data, such as land use land cover data, as well as meteorological data. And so you can see here that unlike a typical heat island, the hottest temperatures or the highest heat island effects are not centered around the urban core, which is here in downtown central Sacramento. But you can actually see that the bigger heat island effects are here in the north and east, where like sort of in the rural outlying regions of the greater Sacramento region. And this shows, why it's important to undertake that model, because the results may not be what you expect. And so this is partly because of the prevailing atmospheric patterns in our region that push heat islands to the north and to the east into the foothills of the Sierra. But it's also important to understand that this shows a 24-hour average heat island index, not the absolute temperatures. So Roseville is not 10 degrees hotter than Sacramento, it's just 10 degrees hotter than its surrounding rural areas. And so really to actually understand vulnerability one step further, it's also important for us to take into account the actual absolute temperatures to really understand which areas were more impacted by extreme heat. So as a next step, we combined the heat island effect with the absolute temperatures to basically draw up these maps of the actual areas that were most vulnerable to heat. So you can see here that Roseville still shows up as a highly vulnerable area, but then also on the map on the right, you see that some of North Sacramento County, and some of the areas that the Sacramento Air District has identified as having more severe burdens due to air pollution are also identified as being vulnerable. And this also includes communities that score more highly on Cal EnviroScreen. So this sort of was our starting picture of the most vulnerable locations in our region. And then next we moved on to identifying solutions that we would like to test and model in the heat island model. To do this, we worked with our project technical advisory committee, which consisted of local jurisdictions, utilities, nonprofits, and other stakeholders from around the capital region. Obviously, we identified some common heat island reduction strategies, or well-known strategies, such as tree canopy, cool pavements, and cool roofs. But our technical committee was also interested in some more novel strategies to help cool the urban environment. And these included vehicle electrification, cool walls, infill development, and solar panels as parking lot shading. I could go a little bit into how they work. For example, electric vehicles work because they don't generate excess heat the way combustion vehicles do from their tailpipe and their engine. And infill helps to avoid heat island effects by reducing the amount of new roads and new rooftops that are built, and also reduces the loss of natural and working lands to development. And solar panels and cool walls work similarly to tree canopy and cool roofs by providing more shading and by reflecting more sunlight. And so once we had identified these strategies, we evaluated basically how effective they were. Our modeling results are pretty extensive, so I won't go into all of them, but this is just a quick snapshot of what it looks like. This shows the effect of a moderate increase in tree canopy at 12 percentage points at 1 p.m. And then this shows a larger increase in tree canopy, a more ambitious level of improvement. This shows a moderate increase in the albedo of roofs and pavement. Albedo is a ratio that measures how much solar heat is reflected by roofs and pavements from 0 to 1. So a 0.15 increase is pretty moderate. And most rooftops right now are probably around that. So it's essentially improving on what we already have. The minimum in the state building code that's required to be considered a cool roof is about 0.63. So that just shows you that this is actually a pretty reasonable change that we're looking at. And this shows the effect of a larger increase in albedos of roof and pavements. And you can see now that the cooling effect is getting much greater. And finally, this shows a combined scenario that was determined to be the most effective, that basically combines the moderate increase in tree canopy with a higher increase in roof albedo and pavements. And so you can see here that a 7-degree cooling difference can be very significant for people on a hot summer's day. I don't want to go into all of our conclusions since there's a whole 300-page report dedicated to that, but I just wanted to highlight quickly some of our main findings that can help shape adaptation strategies. One of the biggest conclusions we found was that the strategies we have today implemented at reasonable and feasible technical levels can effectively reduce the heat island effect, both right now and also in the 2050 climate, which we also modeled. And so these are essentially no regret strategies that we should implement. We're not asking for new technology, but these are cool roofs that we have. And these are also, tree canopy solutions that are well known. We also found that regional collaboration is really important. If strategies are implemented together by multiple jurisdictions, then the cooling impact can double for many strategies. And this really shows why we should work together, because of the downwind, upwind effects, heat is transported around the region. So just one jurisdiction implementing strategies alone won't be as effective as many jurisdictions in an air basin working together. We also found that the cooling impacts are greater at the local scale than regionally. The image I showed earlier showed the regional impacts, but when you dive in and look at the sort of very localized modeling, you get even greater cooling impacts. This is because if you think about it, you're standing near a grove of shady trees, you get immediate cooling benefits from that grove of shady trees, but their effects are much more diffuse when you average it out across a larger area. And so to make the case for improving heat islands in underserved and marginalized communities, we evaluated specifically implementing cooling strategies in Sacramento's areas that are most burdened by air pollution. And that's what you see on the right. And so when we tested these strategies in these underserved communities, we found that that there was almost a 9 degrees cooling, which again is very impactful because these are communities with less tree canopy than their wealthier counterparts and with more paved surfaces. And finally, the last important takeaway I want to highlight is that we really found that it was really important to consider your goals. If public health is a key goal, then it's really important to reduce temperatures at night, because during a heat wave, human bodies need that respite and cooler temperatures at night to be able to cool down. And so in that case, the tree canopy might be the most important strategy for you to invest in, because trees deliver cooling across the 24 hours through both shading and evapotranspiration. On the other hand, if you're in utility and you want to reduce energy use and maintain grid stability, then you might want to invest in cool pavements and cool roofs, because these deliver the greatest cooling benefits in the afternoon and early evening. And so the right goal and the really helps to determine what your strategies could be for reducing heat island. Sort of to summarize that, we created this matrix that highlighted the effectiveness of different implementation scenarios at different times of day for different jurisdictions across the Sacramento region. It's a little bit complicated to read, but essentially this captures the fact that tree canopy can be the most effective in the morning and late at night, while the combination scenario of both tree canopy and roof and pavement improvements were more effective towards later on in the day. And this we created this to help guide strategy selection and implementation. And finally, I just wanted to quickly touch upon our community outreach. We really wanted to understand resident experiences about extreme heat, and as well as their transportation challenges. Since this was a Caltrans funded grant, we wanted to understand whether people were exposed to heat as they were commuting, as they were biking and walking, and whether people were interested in strategies that would help reduce heat exposure as they were out and about. And so we put together a survey that conveyed all these questions, and the survey was conducted both online and in person. This was 2019, so we were able to attend 24 community events over 6 months across the region. We were going to events that were not really attracting environmentalists, but rather hosted by community-based organizations for a diverse range of communities and around Sacramento. Events included, for example, a Hmong health fair that was focused on addressing healthcare disparities, several Lunar New Year festival celebrations, and some rural events in Yuba and Sutter County. And so we think that being able to go to these events in person allowed us to get a wider range of responses. And we were also able to get about a third of our total of 1,600 responses from these in-person events. And the map on the left shows an example of one of the survey questions where we asked people about their exposure to extreme heat. And so you can see that in the urban center, there were relatively few people that didn't experience, it's actually a little weirdly worded, but that basically the urban core people were more exposed to heat. And just to quickly touch upon our next steps, we are working on recommending implementation of these strategies. We are working through the Air District to provide recommendations to our local partner jurisdictions on implementing cool roofs, cool pavements, and more tree canopy as part of new development. We're also recommending that they include these policies and strategies in their general plan updates, in their climate action plans, and also like housing elements and other documents. And then through the Capital Region Climate Readiness Collaborative, we're working on regional coordination and education, and we're hoping to develop some more projects this year to help recommend the implementation of these strategies. We're very excited to keep working on this so that the document doesn't just stay on the shelf, but is turned into actionable strategies around the region. And so I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much. Also here are links to our project's website and reports, as well as interactive maps. You can actually download the heat island data if you're interested. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shelley. If anyone has any questions, feel free to send them in the chat. And if not, we will go ahead and move to Shasta's presentation. Shasta, are you good to go with your screen share?
I am good to go, and I apologize. I would know I was supposed to go first, but the phone rang and it was my chairman. And if any of you know, when your boss is calling and your boss is basically like the president of the country, you kind of have to pick up. So I apologize. The timing was just absolutely unperfect for being able to present in the order as intended. So let me just start the slides here. So first of all, thank you so much for letting me come on today and talk to you about some of the work we've done here in Pala on climate adaptation planning. I am coming to you today from Payomkawacham territory, which is otherwise known as Luiseno. And this is the area that the colonizers named San Diego, California. Great to see that in the chat that a lot of you are using the website to see what territory you are currently on. I would caution that that's a great start, but if you have the opportunity to dig a little deeper and find out the specific tribal nation that is associated with the land you are currently living on, that's a great thing to do, and just use that as a starting point. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our adaptation strategies here in Pala, but also about a really great program we've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years called the Tribal Climate Health Project. And the Tribal Climate Health Project is intended to give tribes all over the country the tools that they need to do their own vulnerability assessments and create adaptation plans. And this has been a project with a lot of different inputs. It's operated by Paula. I am the director and the overseer. We work with a terrific consultant called Prosper Sustainably. And with them, along with an advisory group of folks from all over the country, both from tribal nations and also in a lot of other climate change agencies and spaces, we've been able to develop this program, and there's a website associated with it. I'll share the link a little bit later. So this collaboration has been intended to help tribes feel like they're not alone in the vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning process. You may know that in California, there's 104 federally recognized tribes, and there are dozens of non-federally recognized tribes as well. And they all have concerns about adaptation planning for climate change. So developing capacity for tribes to be able to do that for themselves has been really important for us. And it starts with giving people the tools that they need so that they don't have to start from scratch and develop everything all on their own. It doesn't make sense to redo something that has already been done, especially if you can customize it for your particular community. So that's why we have all these different pieces as part of the overall climate adaptation planning project. So I'm going to go over this briefly because you've been doing this, it sounds like, for a couple of webinar sessions now. So you, I'm sure, already know what adaptation planning involves. We have our primary exposures on the outside ring that lead to these secondary exposures, just like air quality that we just heard about, food security, vector changes. There's all sorts of things that we have to be concerned with in California. And then in the middle, we have health impacts. And we found that that was something that a lot of people weren't necessarily getting to in their adaptation planning. They were stopping at the inner layer and saying, all right, well, what do we do about these big things? But not really considering some of the things that are especially important to tribes, like cultural and spiritual health. What is the impact on a tribal community when climate change, for example, makes it so that acorns don't ripen, essentially become ready for harvest at the usual and accustomed times, and you don't have the acorns to create traditional foods for important ceremonial occasions? That has an impact on your cultural and spiritual health. And that's, of course, linked with mental health. And then the physical and socioeconomic is all a part of that. So you have to plan for all of these things as part of your overall adaptation planning and your vulnerability assessment. So as part of Tribal Climate Health Project, we have this pretty basic strategy that, again, I think you're probably familiar with for what you do first. Obviously, you need to identify your vulnerabilities, and then you build your adaptation plan on the basis of those vulnerabilities. What can you do? What are the interventions for reducing those vulnerabilities, for improving community resilience and health? And then we see at the end here, there's just this constant cycle of, adopting the strategy, implementing it, evaluating it to see how it's doing, updating it based on your evaluation, and then adopting a new version or an updated version of your adaptation plan. So It just is a continuous cycle. It would be nice to be able to say you can just implement your first adaptation plan and you're done. Everything's fine. It's not that simple. There's always new things coming up. And since we've talked a little bit already in the previous presentation about engaging with the community, as you implement and evaluate, you may find that your community members come up with things that you hadn't previously considered that you might want to adopt into an update of your adaptation plan. So steps, it looks like we have the same steps that were already shared at the beginning of today's webinar, and that's good. That means that we're on the same page, we're on the same track. It doesn't make sense for there to be a different set of steps for one process than for another. The steps are all the same, you know, and starting with determining your objectives and your scope. For tribes, you know, a big question may be, did this direction come from tribal leadership? Do you have buy-in from the people who are the elected officials, the leaders of the tribe? And especially for somebody like me, I am a tribal staff person, but I am not a tribal member. I am of European origin. I can't just assume that what I'm doing is going to be what is in line with the tribe's needs and goals, especially from a cultural standpoint. So you want to make sure that you have that tribal buy-in, and that includes community buy-in. If you don't have the leadership saying they want this done, then the community is not likely to be interested in being involved in your adaptation planning or your vulnerability assessments. So, you know, from our side of things as the adaptation professionals, we can assess the resources and capacity. We set the parameters for how we want to assess our adaptation planning process. We have some sample goals here that come from Paula's adaptation plan. And we think it's important to have a vision statement so you know what it is you're trying to accomplish. In a smaller community like Paula, we only have about 1,000 residents here. It might be a little bit easier to apply that vision than in a community like Sacramento, which, you know, including the surrounding areas, is going to be millions of people. But the basic process is still the same. You still want to see what the overall, or set an overall set of goals for your planning process. Number two, a long list of adaptation strategies. So there's a lot of different places you can go to find different ideas for strategies for adaptation planning. On the Tribal Climate Health Project website, we have a whole bunch of different information that you can use to help generate that initial list. Some things are obviously going to be less relevant to your community than others, even though, since we're focused on tribes throughout the nation, we have adaptation strategies for melting ice. That's not really going to be an issue in California, but it is an issue for Alaska Native tribes. So we have that on the list. So it's kind of easier to cross things out that you don't need than it is to include the things that you do need. But getting together and brainstorming actions, especially with the community, they can often come up with ideas that you may not have considered on your own. So again, part of the Tribal Climate Health Project framework and our tools is we've got a whole bunch of different resources to help develop that long list of adaptation strategies and to evaluate and prioritize that longer list so that you can turn it into a shorter list that may actually make it into your adaptation plan. And again, I'll share the website with you at the end so that you can take a look at this for yourself. These are things that apply not just to tribal communities, but they are good adaptation strategies for all communities. And I just want to make the point as well that climate change doesn't stop at jurisdictional boundaries. So just because you have a tribal reservation boundary and it may be near the jurisdiction that you're responsible for, it's a good idea to reach out to your neighboring tribes and find out what they're doing and see if there's any opportunities for collaboration there, because bad air quality doesn't care if it's suddenly on tribal land and vice versa. So if you find these tools useful, then we're thrilled. They are not just for tribes. This is an example of one of our tools. If you're like me and you're terrified of Excel, then this might scare you. Excel is my kryptonite. I don't do well with it. But this was developed with Angie Hacker from Prosper Sustainably. And right now it's just in Excel form, but this is what we call the EASY tool. And it is the, I can never remember what our dang acronym stands for. It's exposures, impacts, and strategies. And the I stands for something, tool. And this is filled out for Paula, but you can download a blank form, a blank version of this from our website, and you can fill it in for yourself. It has the adaptation strategy options, but if you see here, we've got the X's filled in for the things that are issues for us. So you can fill in what's a problem for you, and there's all sorts of drop downs and things that you can fill in to help you develop your strategies. And to me, it's kind of like a board game. It can seem kind of confusing when somebody's explaining it to you, but then once you start playing with it, it all starts to make sense. So this is available to anybody who wants to use it. Now, I mentioned that we have, emotional and mental health strategies and impacts that are important. And so we've also developed a psychosocial resilience framework. And that psychosocial resilience framework is specific to tribes. We developed it for Paula, but we made it broad enough that it could be tailored by any given tribe to include what's most important to them from a spiritual and cultural standpoint. But it's all about the things you see here, about building connection, delivering health and psychological first aid resources, communicating and educating your community. And we have here, it says Paula CRT activity. This was part of our Climate Ready Tribes grant that we've been working on for the last 3 years with the National Indian Health Board, and they get their funding from the CDC. So again, these tools are all available on our website. And just a brief list, and I won't go through this, but these are some of the risks that we identified for Paula that we wanted to include in our adaptation plan, just to make sure that we were covering everything. And just, I want to point out briefly that last one about carbon monoxide poisoning. Until I started working on vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning, it didn't even occur to me that carbon monoxide poisoning would be an issue related to climate change, but it is. If there's a power outage because of a public safety power shutoff and somebody uses a generator to keep their air conditioning running and that generator is not properly vented and it's in the house, you can have people who succumb to carbon monoxide poisoning. So that's something to put in your adaptation plan. We've got our short list of strategies, and so those are what you end up putting into your adaptation plan. And this is where we involve the community, and we put out surveys to the tribal community and didn't get the greatest impact with those. What we found was better was, as was suggested in the previous session or webinar, PowerPoint, that's the word that I want. We went out to the community during non-environmentally related events and just talked to people, set up a booth and got them to come and talk to us about what their concerns were. And that was the best way to get stakeholders to be involved in what we were trying to do. Finally, we put that into an adaptation plan, and we have a lot of examples of adaptation plans and strategies, again, on our website that you can take a look at. But I'm going to just move quickly through here. And in fact, this here is the Tribal Climate Health Project website where you can see the sample report and some of the other tools that we've made available to, again, anybody who wants to access them. And then finally, we ended up with this final adaptation plan, but it's one thing to have a plan. The next thing you have to do, of course, is to implement your plan. And so we've started doing that by developing these climate change preparedness information sheets that we have both made available in paper copies at meetings and events, but we also have them available here on the Tribal Climate Health Project website. So these are examples you can use if you're interested in doing these for yourself. It's all about sharing for us. We're not trying to be proprietary with any of this information. And then the last thing is what we're doing to continue this work. And we're doing a lot of collaboration with neighboring tribes. In San Diego County, there are 18 tribal nations, which is more than any other county in the United States, not just in California. So we're now working with the Rincon Band and San Pasqual Band to work together on our adaptation strategies and our adaptation planning. And we got a grant award from the Strategic Growth Council to be able to continue the work that we're doing. But our hope is that we're going to be able to use this CEC Tribal Government Challenge Grant to be able to put our plans together and see where the overlaps are, see where we have synergies, and hopefully be able to develop plans that work for all of us instead of each of us operating in a vacuum. Now, I know that was a lot, so feel free to reach out to me anytime. Here's my phone number. I'm less likely to answer the phone than I am to answer an email. And there is the tribalclimatehealth.org. That's where you can find everything. And I'm also going to throw these into the chat so that you can just click on them very easily. And thanks. I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Shasta. We are now moving into the last speaker in our series of case studies before we move on to the Adaptation Pathways portion of the event. So I'd like to introduce Erica Mertens. She's the Recycling Program Manager at the town of Truckee.
Thanks so much, Taylor, and thanks for having me here with you all. Just a moment while I get us situated here. All right, as Taylor mentioned, I'm Erica Mertens with the town of Truckee, and I am on Washoe tribe land. I oversee our Keep Truckee Green programs, which is our sustainability, resiliency, and solid waste programs. But first and foremost, I really want to recognize some of our former staff members. I was actually just a supporting role in this project, and Nicholas Martin was the project lead, as well as significant contributions from Jillian Greenberg and Aaron Ronald, who were our previous Civic Spark Fellows, and our former town manager, Jeff Lux. I also, we also worked closely with GEOS Institute for our vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan, and followed the whole community planning framework from GEOS Institute. So I'm gonna have a bit of a different talk today than the previous two speakers, but I will really hone in on our community engagement. And first, I'll just give you a brief background of our vulnerabilities here in Truckee. Then I'll go deeper into our community involvement and how we identified strategies. And then lastly, I'll just kind of touch on how we focused on equitable engagement throughout the process. So we're in Truckee, California, which is in the Sierra Nevada. So we have some probably different, like Shasta was saying, our issues here are different than most other parts of the state, but certainly not exclusive when you're looking at wildfire and smoke, declining snowpack, which is also, of course, our water source for the state. And this, on the left-hand side, just shows the timeline that we went through from 2019 through 2020 till where we are now. And on the left-hand side is our vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan. And then on the right side are the climate mitigation CAP development. So I'm going to focus on our strategies in the adaptation portion, which started with a stakeholder workshop, broad community outreach, a community workshop, and then also some community surveys. So our our stakeholder workshop entailed a technical advisory committee of, I believe, 12 partners, and then identified other stakeholders who were across all sectors in our town. We have a lot of special districts. We had ski resort representatives from our fire district, PUD, etc. So in total, we had 31 organizations present. Again, I think both of the former speakers were touching a lot on the collaboration, and that's certainly an approach that we take here in Truckee in order to really have transparency and involvement throughout the process, as well as that important buy-in for the implementation phase. So our stakeholder workshop was a full day. of developing and prioritizing strategies after reviewing our vulnerabilities primer. And this was looking at strategies across all sectors. We split into groups of 5 sector groups. So cultural, economic, health and safety, the infrastructure, and then nature-based solutions. And through that, we went through identifying the co-benefits, trade-offs, equity considerations, the relative cost, effectiveness, and the responsible party of various strategies for the different goals and issues identified. And then at the end of the day, at the end of the workshop, everyone prioritized those strategies that were brainstormed from across the group. So we did a lot of broad outreach leading up to our community workshop, and this sort of served dual purposes for raising awareness of in our upcoming public workshops, but then also to gather feedback directly and promote our surveys. So our GEOS Institute, our consultants, helped us develop some just quick snippet videos. You can view those on the website. I'll tag that later. But these were really just short looks at what the issues are and how people could stay involved. As Shasta said, really, really important just to get out there and table at events. This is a great and easy way to have that direct interaction with people. And we did some kind of mini dot exercises in the field while at these community events, which also allow us to interact with our permanent residents as well as visitors, because we are kind of a unique community here where we have a blend of visitors, second homeowners, as well as full-time residents. We also were conducting surveys on iPads while at these events, and just a really easy thing to do, providing a small swag item like bamboo utensils. People always want prizes. And if you are able to have those little interactions, I think it's a really valuable tool to gain more insight in the community members. Also, again, pumping out the social media machine, we were pairing the workshop for Climate Ready Truckee with another one that we had in kind of close succession, which was our single-use foodware reduction workshops. And this was the first time we really started kind of co-branding all of our materials for the greater good of driving that interest and reaching those similar interest bases. So this is the flyer for our workshop. Again, we're in the mountains, so really trying to appeal to people that, hey, you might be skiing now and then in 2080 with a tremendously reduced snowpack, you'll be on dirt. So really honing in on the emotional drive to get people to come to the workshops. So at the community workshop, it was sort of a mini pared down version of the stakeholder workshop, but we really tried to set the atmosphere in a way that was more approachable for our community members. So it started off with presentations from both GEOS Institute as well as Ascent, who is doing our general plan update. And we did a combination of mitigation and adaptation strategies. And that was really because, for the general public, I think adaptation and mitigation often are the same thing in their mind, where we wanted to hold just one workshop, more bang for your buck to get people in the door. And then we kind of split into 2 groups later on. And Within the group discussions, there were kind of 5 to 7 people, so smaller groups. Really recommend that to encourage that open conversation. And what we did was provide some primers for people different and then the right side shows kind of from the actual exercise to prioritize those strategies. We had we held it at the community rec center as opposed to having town hall. Into coming to town hall, also, you know, it's in the same building as our police department, so it's just to be in a neutral. We also kicked it off with a poet, a song performance, regional youth, really just to try to get the juices flowing for folks to start brainstorming and identify what's important. Had interpreters throughout
Erica?
For Spanish speakers, and of course, importantly,
I think we're having some audio issues. Erica, do you want to try turning off your video? Maybe that'll help.
Yes.
Awesome. I think that's a little better. Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, super. Sorry about that. Inevitably, I evidently have worse Wi-Fi connection within town hall than I do in my own home. So here I am. But again, I'll just repeat the last part in case you weren't able to hear that. We provided childcare because we held the workshop during the evening, had a Spanish interpreter, and food. This is just from the workshop. Again, just one of the small interactive activities that we use to try to get people in the mindset of adaptation planning and strategy brainstorming. So on the left, that diagram is just a question about, you know, what is important to you? What do you like about Truckee? And I think what Shasta was touching on is, you know, each community has its own values and driving ethos. And here in Truckee, it's a small town. We really value our outdoors and the small kind of culture that we have. So on the right, this is just a summary of some of the strategies that were identified for the cultural aspect. Again, all the things that are marked in blue were developed from the actual members of the public. And then the orange items were strategies that were provided either from some sample kind of menu strategy solutions or from the community or from the stakeholder workshop. So lastly, we followed everything up with some community surveys. We received 256 in English and only 26 in Spanish, although those were all of the Spanish surveys were conducted on paper surveys versus the online after the public workshops. And this was really a way for us to try to gather more feedback for people that are unable or disinterested in attending a public workshop. We again had this available bilingually, and the way our surveys worked was a ranking scale of various strategies from 1 to 5. And all of our survey responses, all of the strategies had at least 50% of some level of support And there were a couple interesting strategies that had differences in support from the English to Spanish responses, but for the most part, all strategies had at least 50% support. So again, just following up on our equitable engagement piece, this is something that we tried to look through this lens throughout our process, but some key takeaways that I think are really applicable to any community outreach is just finding your key allies. For us, we have a group of communities leaders called the Promotoras, and we've really tried to foster that relationship because so much of our Latinx population receives information word of mouth. So kind of going to those hubs to disseminate information has been really helpful. Also, again, cannot reiterate this enough, changing the venue, going to people where they're meeting people where they're at instead of asking them to come to you is just very impactful to get more face-to-face interactions and meaningful interactions. We went to schools and apartment complexes to administer those surveys. And then lastly, understanding the cultural framing. Again, you know, it's going to be different for different groups that you might be targeting, but for us, it was really important to reach our Latinx population, which is one that's often underrepresented in our engagement. And so just trying to understand those drivers. Housing here is a really big issue, as it is in most parts of California, but that was one particular issue that we tried to lean on in order to open those conversations. So you can find our complete vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan at our website, keeptruckiegreen.org. Additionally, you can go to GEOS Institute's climatewise.org. They have a tremendous amount of resources, but also a really great complete summary of everything that I just mentioned throughout the process. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Erica. Wow, amazing. So many great things going on across the state. All of you have just presented such great work and so unique to each of your communities. So thank you for sharing. So we have our final speaker, Rob Kay from ICF, excuse me, who is going to introduce Adaptation Pathways.
Thanks, Nikki. And is that sharing okay?
Yes, we can see it great. Thank you.
Fantastic. So Rob Kay with ICF Consulting joining you from ancestral Tongva land here in Studio City down in LA. So I was part of the consulting team that helped Cal OES put together the APG. And part of the conversation there was around highlighting the sort of emerging advantages of using a pathways-based approach, while also recognizing that this is an emerging sort of evolving approach, and that best practices are very much still being developed. And so the way that pathways is featured in the APG is that there is an appendix B, where the pathways process is detailed. And there's also a lift out box that mentions pathways that talks about uncertainty management. And that also speaks to the heritage of pathways, which basically comes from a family of techniques that address vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning, fundamentally from the basis of dealing with uncertainty. All right, I'm just going to go to the next slide. Okay, so pathways contrast to the more traditional predict and plan approach of vulnerability assessments by taking an approach that focuses on thinking about objectives first. So a pathways approach frames what the objectives of the plan is, and then focuses vulnerability assessments around looking at really whether or not those objectives could get off track over time, and how would you actually tell if that was the case. And so there's a couple of key words here. Robustness and flexibility is very much part of the description around pathways. And then the planning and financing focuses around those paths, as well as thinking about, well, what's the issue around course correction? And then if a trigger is exceeded, the if or a threshold is surpassed, then you do something else. So it becomes an if-then approach to thinking about adaptation. So in practice, what does this look like? Well, here's an example from LA Metro's Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. This is an example that was workshopped out with the team at Metro, thinking about a real issue in the Metro, the Red Line, whatever it's called now. I've been in LA long enough that I still call them by the colors. The Red Line here in that runs from Universal into downtown. And there's a real problem because the way in which the elevators were constructed makes them sensitive to extreme heat. And so we workshopped out these 4 examples of adapting. The top one is in green is enhancing operational alternatives. The red one is install cooling equipment. That's B. The third one is increase elevator redundancy. And the fourth one is redesign and replace them. And this pathway diagram shows decision point number 1 on the left-hand side is really to start the pathway through this solid line, the green line, by enhancing operational alternatives. So that means looking at forecasting better, being able to predict when heat waves are coming, be able to actually adjust the operational procedures to be able to have bus bridges and other ways of dealing with the issue. And then at some point in the future, at the transfer point, there will need to be a change. And that some point comes into this triggers and thresholds idea of thinking, well, what are the issues there for Metro? Is that the numbers of times that they have to close elevators down? Is that a county heat threshold? Is it some other combination of factors? So one thing I wanted to point out on here is that you'll notice that time doesn't have a scale on it. And that's quite deliberate because threshold or pathways-based planning doesn't have a fixed time frame. It says at the point where this threshold is exceeded. And again, that again is very deliberate, which really requires a robust monitoring process. So I wanted to put some examples up for you all about where this practice is emerging from. At the state level, the AB 2800 report, the Climate Safe Infrastructure Working Group report really embraced pathways as sort of organizing principle. The Ocean Protection Council, the sea level rise guidance, and I'll come to this in a minute, really embraces pathways-based planning for dealing with long-term sea level rise risks. There's some published examples. I showed you the LA Metro. There's also examples from CEC funded projects. Again, that's I don't know, I've got the links to them here. And then in progress, just to shout out to the work that's going up at the city of Santa Cruz. They're doing some great work around adaptation pathways, funded by Caltrans and the Coastal Commission. And I emailed the planning officer a couple of days ago just to check in the exact status of what's going on there. And she told me that some new reports are about to get released. So it's worth checking their website out. It's important then to recognize that the Coastal Commission sea level rise guidance really embraces pathways in the way in which it requires assessments around the California coast. And I highlighted the text there to align design flexibility. So again, there's some very specific language in the guidance document that really leans on thinking about, well, okay, you're going to do an assessment over the lifetime of the project, but start thinking about thresholds and triggers after a project period. Think about adaptive planning over the long term using a pathways-based approach. So just closing out on the benefits, the key benefit for me here is being able to think long-term and short-term at the same time. Pathways allows you to walk and chew gum in your adaptation planning approach by thinking about, well, what do we need to do now? What's most critical now? And then in the long term, how do we start building up to additional investments, and how do we tell when we need those? And that's point number 2, thinking about supporting implementation. In particular, if adaptation actions require a lot of funding involved in them, it starts to build the case by saying, well, you know what, when things get bad like this, we're going to need to do this. And again, having that flagged up in advance. The other big benefit too with pathways-based planning, in my opinion, is that it allows organizations to start to work together to figure out where the thresholds are for particular types of decisions. So for example, infrastructure providers may be thinking about triggers and long-term adaptation in a slightly different way to local governments or local communities, and actually aligning those a little bit better, again, is a key opportunity, particularly when you're using group-based processes, and we've heard fantastic examples of those before. I've run a number of workshops where you can interactively design pathways, and it's really very an empowering process. Now, on the flip side, this isn't easy. Doing this work, it's different. It's new. Like I said before, it's emerging, and so I just wanted to be transparent about the challenges here. Clearly defining shared objectives, again, in any planning process is not easy, and this requires those to be considered explicitly. A triggers and threshold assessment is difficult, both within an organization, as I said with Metro, but also thinking regionally, how do they all fit together? And then if you're really going to embrace a pathways approach, you have to be very deliberative about setting up and maintaining monitoring and evaluation systems, and that's not trivial, both technically as well as from a governance perspective. And then challenge number 5 is, well, is actually thinking through, well, okay, if a trigger is exceeded, then what is actually going to happen? Are you really committing effectively future decision makers to take actions that you, in this generation, us, have determined are critical? There's also some biases here. This issue of saying, well, actually, we need to be flexible here over time, versus the regulatory and governance processes that really very much skew towards certainty, towards the sort of need for certainty. Again, I don't want to underestimate those. And then finally, this is like, it's new. Sometimes it's difficult to explain. It takes a while to get into the mindset. It's not an easy task. And I'll just leave finally that I would just put a question here. We've all been living in a pandemic-generated pathways world. When certain thresholds are reached, then we will all reach a new tier in our region. Now, is that going to trigger in the future sort of muscle memory of like, oh no, that was like when we were in the pandemic? Or has this enabled us to actually have a more socialized language, the way in which we will actually talk about making decisions over time? So I just posed that question. And please reach out if you want to talk pathways. Always happy to do that. Thanks, Taylor and Nikki, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Robert, and to all of our other speakers as well. We will now move into the question and answer portion of the webinar. Just going to pull up that slide now. We invite you to raise your hand, and you can send a question via audio. That way we can call on you, or you're also more than welcome to send it in the chat. Our team member, Sydney Short, will be monitoring for questions. And if not, we have some prepared as well.
So if no one has any questions to start, we can start with the question. So in her presentation, Shasta touched on the importance of recognizing the cultural, land, and spiritual health needs of communities during the adaptation planning process. What methods have you used to build a stronger and more intentional understanding of the community you are crafting strategies for?
Well, excuse me. That question makes me choke. It's because I'm not a member of the Paula tribal community. It's definitely something that I've had to tread carefully on, because when you're working with tribes, there's a lot of information out there that you aren't necessarily going to have access to if you're not part of that community. And there's also information that might not be appropriate to put into a public facing document, even if it's just facing the tribal public. Not everybody, even within the tribe, is going to have access to some of the same information that everybody does. But that being said, I mean, I've worked here in Paula. I've worked for the tribe for 16 years, and I've done research here as an anthropologist for over 20. So that's a long time to get to know a community. But it really comes back to the same things that we've already been hearing today, which is talk to the members of the community themselves and find out what their biggest issues are, because what you assume are the things that they are interested in or concerned about may not be the same things that you expect them to be interested in or concerned about. So the more time you spend talking to people, and it doesn't have to be even from a climate perspective, it can just be asking people about what's changed. And when they talk about how the river doesn't flow anymore, or they can't jump off the bridge like they did when they were little kids and into the swimming hole. Those are things that start to show you what some of the important things are in people's thinking. And same thing, I use the example of acorns. And so you may not know, if you're going into a community, what sorts of traditional foods or events or anything they might have. But when you say, has anything happened or is anything happening with the weather that's making it harder for you to do things you're used to doing? And then you'll start to hear about those sorts of things. And again, for a person who doesn't know the tribal community, they're not going to know that acorns are an important traditional food. But when you say, has there been anything you can't do because it's been too hot, or because the foods or just what's happening? And they say, you know what, the acorns don't ripen anymore. Or that they don't even grow. And so I wasn't able to have wee wish when my grandson was born, and that's the traditional acorn mush. You go, okay, so that's something that we need to be concerned about. It's not just about oak tree death, it's about the potential impact on a traditional cultural practice that's related to the oak trees. So, the short answer is you have to be an ethnographer and you have to talk to people. If you don't know what an ethnographer is, it's a nosy person who hides their nosiness by giving it the fancy word ethnographer or anthropologist. But there's really no substitute to spending time in the community.
Great. So next we have a question for Rob. How is the Adaptation Pathways approach different than traditional adaptive management, or is there a difference?
Yeah, thanks, Sydney. I just chatted Phil a response. Yeah, I mean, they're effectively like two children from the same heritage, if you like, that, or pick your metaphor. There's a lot of thinking of adaptive management, which is, of course, adapt and change as you evolve over time. My experience, I guess, of the strict application of pathways is that it tends to get more rigorous around triggers and thresholds assessment and puts those out there in advance. But again, that's just my sort of particular take on those two approaches. The other thing too that pathways allows you to do, again in my experience, is really lead up to really transformative decisions. So as in, we're doing incremental changes over time, but we've recognized that there are some really big problems coming down the line, and that by thinking about what those are, you're sort of building up to them much more deliberately and setting the the thresholds at which you were changed. But again, if adaptive management is implemented strictly along the same lines, then again there's lots to share. So Phil, in your experience, I mean, if adaptive management is a way into using pathways in a particular approach, then that's good. That's a good thing, and we should build on that.
Great. So another question following up on what Shasta said, how have panelists framed the potential impacts of climate change using language that is accessible, understandable, and not overly technical?
Am I supposed to answer that, or is it just because I started it? I want to give somebody else the opportunity.
I can go ahead and jump in there. That's certainly a great question and something that is always a struggle, as I think it's easy when you are working in this technical area and you're so comfortable with it. Understanding how to break it down to the layperson, I think, is a real skill and something that we're always working on. But I think our climate primer and the vulnerability assessment in conjunction with like the little short videos that I was talking about were really helpful ways of making it really truly digestible in terms of what are the threats to our community. And some of that was just very simple graphs breaking down, here are the number of days over 90 degrees that we have currently, and then looking at it over the span of the next 50 to 80 years, looking at snowfall and the number of freezing nights below freezing, again, tremendously decreasing. Those, I think, just showing some of those graphs and really trying to explain what the implications of those are is how we tried to express the critical importance of this work.
Yeah, and I think that similarly to what other panelists said, I think for us, it was always a challenge to translate very technical concepts like the urban heat island into simple language. But I found that using analogies helped a lot, like asking people to imagine, just being in the middle of an asphalt parking lot on a hot summer's day. That's something people can relate to. And then asking people to think about, like, what does it feel when you immediately go into a shade of a tree nearby? And so sort of really trying to translate it into what people understand from their daily lives instead of the scientific and technical language that is often used to describe heat islands. I think it's always something that we can improve upon and do better. During our tabling events, we also try to have maps and fact sheets that were in simple language, and we also, with graphics and visuals, try to make them as appealing as possible. But I think sometimes we overthink things, and it's just we don't do always as good of a job as we can. So always room to improve.
Great, so we should have time for one more question. So Erica emphasized the importance of conducting outreach at local, frequently visited locations that are easily accessible for the community. What methods of outreach did you find most successful in garnering feedback? What surprised you about your community engagement and outreach process?
Yeah, so we have a really popular event in Truckee, or we did in 2019, called Truckee Thursdays. That is a basically a street festival that happens every Thursday evening where we shut down our downtown Truckee. So if anyone's ever visited here, we've got that main commercial row historic downtown area, and it brings a lot of people from our visitors to public residents, kind of 50-50 split, I would say. Another place that we didn't do tabling for this particular outreach, but have in the past, is also the farmers markets, because you'll see a lot of folks. But I think one of the challenges is not kind of cherry picking the audience. So trying to really be broad in the different types of events, I think, is helpful. But one thing that surprised me, I think just the creativity of our community members. People, you know, we think we're experts in the field, but when you start talking to people, you'll hear so many different unique ideas of how to address the problem. So I think that was one thing that was inspiring and also insightful.
For us, one thing that worked really well was that we tried to attend also a wide range of events that were for all kinds of people and communities and not just environmentalists. And we also offered prizes. But one thing that we found really was interesting was when we had the same prizes without just like for people to take if they could complete a survey, people weren't as interested. But as soon as we brought a prize wheel with the same prizes, no changes other than the prize wheel, people were really attracted by that. And we got so much more participation just through the addition of something that made it a game of chance. Instead of like, oh, you could pick whatever prize you win, or versus you could spin this prize wheel and the prize wheel would determine what you win. And people were like, wow, that's so much more exciting. So that worked really well, and bringing a non-environmental audience to us. And then I think in terms of other outreach strategies that worked well was really, like not cherry picking events and, you know, attending all the events that we could. I think it was so much easier pre-pandemic to really just to go out there and talk to people and to basically share mapping exercises and ask people what they were experiencing.
Prize wheels are the best. I even spin our own prize wheel. I'm like, I can have any prize I want, but I still want to spin the wheel.
We had the exact same phenomenon happen with the prize wheel. So I think if you want to have a line out your booth, put a prize wheel.
Awesome. So many amazing insights. And apologies, I did drop off a couple times for internet, but hopefully sounds like everything went smoothly while I was gone. I just want to thank all of you and all of our participants for the questions and for the amazing insights that you provided today. This webinar has been recorded, and we will send it out to anyone who registered, as well as the chat notes. There's been a lot of resources and information shared in the chat here, and the slides will be shared as well. So thanks again, everybody. Any questions, reach out to us. Our emails are on the screen here, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.